So I'm going to briefly then go over our speakers today and the agenda. Aditi, if you want to forward one slide, please. And a big thanks to Aditi, who's helping us to show the slides here in the background, as well as my colleague, Craig. So just in terms of who will be speaking today, I don't have time, unfortunately, to share their bios, but we will be sharing out the recording and these slides, and the bios are hyperlinked there on the slides. So we're going to start off. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca D. Winter-Schmidt. I am the Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and I will be setting the stage a bit and giving you some background on this pilot project here in a second. But then we are going to review some of the high-level findings of the pilot project. This project was conducted by 3 project partners. You can see our logos up top there. We have PeaceNexus Foundation, who was a funder and an expert, as well as Heartland Initiative, who has provided expertise as well throughout this project. And so Mallory Miller, who's the legal advisor at Heartland Initiative, will, together with myself, give you a sense of some of the findings in terms of learnings from the participating companies in terms of what good CAHRA, I'm going to use this word a lot today, CAHRA, conflict affected and high risk areas. So what good CAHRA policies look like, what good heightened human rights due diligence policies look like, and what good governance looks like, as well as addressing some of the remaining gaps and challenges. That will be followed then by about a 30-minute moderated session, moderated by Sam Jones. You see him here, president and co-founder of Heartland Initiative. And Sam will be speaking with 3 of our investors who are very active in this project. The first one is Camille Biscont de Saint-Julien from La Banque Postale Asset Management. And then if you go to the next slide, we'll also hear from Therese Stenmark, Senior ESG Analyst at Scandia, and Tulia Machado-Helland, who is Head of Human Rights at Storebrand Asset Management. And then we are going to be turning it over to Kristen Petillon from PeaceNexus Foundation, and Kristen is going to lead us through the Q&A. So that's the plan for today. And Aditi, if you advance one more slide, let me just give you a bit of the background about the project itself. As I said, 3 project partners. We also had a set of 22 lead and support investors who formed teams to engage with the companies. We had selected a set of 3 tech and ICT companies and 1 renewable energy company. They were selected based on a number of factors, including that they were identified as leaders in their field in terms of managing their CAHRA-related risks, and also ones who were willing to be very responsive and engage in a set of 3 dialogues over the course of this 18-month-long project under Chatham House rules in order to allow for a more open and frank exchange of leading practices, but also of challenges and dilemmas faced when operating in these complex environments. These companies, in addition to being willing to participate, we've shared with them some bilateral recommendations, and we'll be following up on those recommendations in the coming weeks. I probably should have started with the purpose of the project. I'm hoping it's fairly straightforward. Those of you who are attending here are probably attending because you're very aware of the fact that we are currently, in a period of time where we see a growing number and intensity of conflicts happening around the world. A lot of very unstable and complex situations in which companies are either operating directly or to which they have ties through their value chains. And this project was really an effort to help investors in particular understand how to better manage their exposure to these types of CAHRA risks by engaging their portfolio companies. And I would say that this project hopefully also is of value to the companies themselves and those who maybe just be listening and are picking up this guidance to understand what is indeed possible, but also very frankly, what we still need to address where we don't always have easy answers. We also did quite a bit of capacity building. In addition to this webinar, we had a launch webinar, which is available on our website, which has, I think, some useful information in terms of what existing guidance is out there. But certainly this project also helps address gaps in guidance. And I think that's something that there's still much work that still needs to be done. A lot of investors hold a number of companies that have a high degree of CAHRA exposure, and really we need to figure out how to prioritize which companies to engage with. The project report, which will be coming out today, provides some of the lessons learned from this, as I said, and also some of those outstanding challenges, as well as identifying guidance for investors in terms of how to prioritize risk identification and management, and tips just on how to engage more effectively with companies. So if you have a chance after this webinar, please do take a moment to look through that report. Okay, Aditi, if we go one slide further, let's just dive right in now into some of our high-level findings. So let's start off with policy. I think one of the leading practices that we saw was that of the Renewable Energy Company, which actually published a high-level commitment in their human rights policy to conduct HRDD, short for heightened human rights due diligence, in conflict settings to which they were exposed. But beyond that, we saw a number of companies also have specific policies and practices in terms of, for example, undertaking know your customer or sales due diligence for services and products that were being supplied in CAHRA settings, in particular relevant when operating with state actors, some of whom do not always have the best human rights track records. Another good example we saw, and Tulia's going to elaborate on this in a second here, was the enumeration of salient CAHRA risks that were identified, often through a human rights impact assessment process, human rights risk assessment process. And then in particular, a good practice we saw was a chart that had been published where the salient CAHRA risks were listed on one axis and then the specific impacted stakeholders on the other. So for example, workers in the value chains, employees, impacted communities. So there are definitely some leading practices out there that I think we all can look to and learn from. In terms of gap, I'd say the big one is that no one had a standalone CAHRA policy, which really outlined in detail the steps of that heightened human rights due diligence process. And as you know, heightened human rights due diligence, in particular when undertaken in a conflict setting, also needs to entail a good conflict risk analysis to understand how a company's business activities are impacting on the conflicts of the dynamic itself and that conflict actors. That was missing at that level of detail, as well as a clear sharing of information disclosures around how in conflict settings in particular, a analysis of international humanitarian law implications of business activities were undertaken. So I'm going to hand it over now to Mallory, and Mallory is going to talk to us a little bit about what she found in terms of heightened human rights due diligence practices. Mallory, over to you. And I think you may be on mute, Mallory, because we can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute myself. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Mallory. I'm a legal advisor with Heartland Initiative. I also, in addition to providing technical expertise, I participated in company dialogues and supported the project report through identifying themes, leading practices, and gaps in the company's human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence practices. I'm going to briefly go over some of the highlights that you will see in the pilot project report. Like Rebecca already mentioned, the companies in the pilot project were selected based on their status as an industry leader, so we were not surprised to see that all the companies had very robust human rights due diligence processes. Many of these were embedded in their sales or project initiation process as well. We identified several leading practices for managing CAHRA risks in these human rights due diligence processes, including considering the geographic context of potential markets, sales, or projects to identify CAHRA. Also, when defining CAHRA, all of the companies demonstrated leading practices as they integrated government human rights reports, civil society reporting, and sophisticated data providers focused on geopolitical risk and fragility. Finally, all of the human rights due diligence processes also had the ability to escalate the due diligence to heightened human rights due diligence. However, a few of the gaps that we saw also centered around this idea of conflating these leading human rights due diligence practices with heightened human rights due diligence. For example, in several of the conversations, companies relied on their human rights due diligence practice instead of a heightened human rights due diligence process that should have been implemented based on the conflict-affected area. In addition, while many of the human rights due diligence processes could be escalated to heightened human rights due diligence, there was limited information on the triggers and thresholds for initiating this analysis or the standards for what this analysis would entail. A few other quick gaps we saw included limited knowledge on the application of international humanitarian law and limited stakeholder engagement with impacted parties in CAHRA. We recognize both of these issues can be complex, with international humanitarian law often requiring outside expertise and the difficulties surrounding engaging individuals in active conflict zones. However, we saw both of these areas as gaps in the current due diligence processes that could be addressed to better mitigate human rights and conflict-related risks. So I'll turn that back over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Mallory, and a really good summation. Really appreciate that. So then finally, we looked at leading practices and gaps in regards to governance. And I think what we saw on the one hand positively, where clear lines of authority and responsibility in terms of who and which departments were responsible for oversight and implementation of CAHRA risk management efforts, to include understanding exactly when situations needed to be moved up to the board level for decision-making purposes. Similarly, we saw a number of the tech companies have very good cross-functional crisis response teams, bringing in the needed, various departments or divisions within the company, oftentimes bringing in needed CAHRA expertise, if necessary, also externally. One company in particular actually had gone to the International Committee of the Red Cross for some advice and support. On the flip side, we did see, as I said, positively cross-functional crisis response teams, but at times the crisis response itself, who was involved, crisis protocols could be a bit ad hoc. And it was not always clear if there were efforts to draw lessons learned from the crisis response itself to carry those lessons moving forward. At times, there was a lack of CAHRA expertise at the board level or senior management level, but again, often mitigated with bringing in external expertise, but nevertheless good when that expertise resides in-house if at all possible. And then while there were some good examples in the cross-functional teams of people who had expertise, learning, local knowledge, cultural specific knowledge in the context of particular conflicts, it was clear that there was room for more consistent and far-reaching training and capacity building across all the relevant business functions within the company. And then I say overall, generally, a lack of disclosures, not only in terms of the CAHRA risk management processes, but also in terms of lines of authority and responsibility as part of that process. Okay, and just very briefly, because we want to move on to our moderated discussion here, just in terms of, I think, some of the positive outcomes and impacts for investors, I think this is really an effort to move beyond reactive to more proactive CAHRA risk management of portfolio holdings. I think this was, certainly a very kind of small and in-depth project, but I think there's learnings that can be scaled up across other companies as well. I think part of that was also being able to understand better for investors how to undertake risk prioritization. Here, very helpful was the saliency materiality nexus methodology that Heartland has developed to really focus initially on where there's an intersection between salient and severe human rights risks and humanitarian law impacts and financially material impacts on companies and hence investors. And if Aditi or Craig, if you have the link to the saliency materiality nexus report that Heartland put out with Westpath and Schroders, please do put that in the chat, because that can explain this methodology in more detail. In addition, we had developed a set of high-level investor principles, which you'll find on our engagement webpage, that really help to kind of formulate expectations around what good heightened human rights due diligence looks like to companies. And that, of course, was based on guidance that was put out by the UNDP and UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, I believe last year, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think, certainly, as I said, helping investors, try to understand how to better incorporate considerations around CAHRA risks into investment decision-making and ongoing stewardship activities with companies. But at the same time, frankly, recognizing there's still challenges that we need to address. And there's certainly work ahead of us. One of the first things that pops into my mind is the challenges around, engaging with businesses that have activities in occupied territories. And thanks, Rich. I think Rich just put the saliency materiality nexus report in the chat. Next slide, Aditi. For the companies, again, we had companies who were very willing, and we're grateful for how willing they were to engage with us over the course of these 18 months. I think, what was potentially, I hope, useful for them was to have a streamlined dialogue with a larger group of investors rather than a number of, one-off bilateral dialogues. The opportunity, frankly, to hopefully also showcase some of these leading practices to those investors, and then through this report to disseminate this to a larger audience. And then really, as I said before, just to have this space for mutual exchange and learning, and hence the need to do this under Chatham House rule. Okay, and I think next slide, Aditi. Just outputs, we know about the report. We've mentioned the webinars already. Just want to say that we also are grateful to have a much larger network than these 22 investors who are interested in taking this work forward. I think, very much needed, unfortunately, at this current geopolitical time that we find ourselves in. Okay, and with that, next slide, Aditi, I am going to hand it over to Sam, who's going to moderate the discussion with Tulia, Therese, and Camille. Sam, over to you.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks,
so much.
Rebecca. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And just to zoom out for a second, I mean, so in a reflection about the value of this project, so we've been providing technical support to investor-led company engagements for over a decade across different industries. And I have to say that the level of granularity, detail, and transparency that we were able to achieve in these dialogues with companies at the policy level, the practice level, and the governance level related to CAHRA, it's really some of the most detailed conversations that we've been able to hear, and I think that's a testament to the leadership of the investors and putting together the engagements, and to the companies themselves in terms of the level of transparency. So with that, I'm going to direct my first question to Therese Sandmark from Scandia. So Therese, can you walk us through some of the most salient CAHRA-related risk that the engaged tech companies face? And can you give a specific example of a leading practice that stood out to you, and one outstanding challenge the companies struggle with or continue to struggle with? Thanks. Over to you, Therese.
Yeah, thank you. So when it comes to the telco and tech companies, they represent very different product and services, but we did note some common risks, and that was that their exposure to these risks were often linked to surveillance or censorship or incitement to violence in the same high-risk geographies like China and Myanmar and Saudi Arabia. And they also have risk exposure through their value chain relationships, such as with state military or law enforcement agencies or occupying authorities. And then just by their presence in these high-risk geographies, they're also exposed to an array of different human rights risks, such as violations to the right to privacy, freedom of expressions, or arbitrary detention even, etc. So that what we found was common for these companies. When it comes to examples of leading practice and challenges, I will start with a challenge, and that was also Rebecca and Mallory mentioned it, and it also comes through in the report, is that that for the usual human rights due diligence, there are clear policies and procedures, but for risk relating to conflict-affected and high-risk areas or heightened human rights due diligence processes, these are not documented as consistently or as standalone. So at the beginning of this pilot project, and when we started dialogue with the companies, we spent a lot of time talking to the companies to try to understand how this is it flows through the companies. So, and creating an understanding for how these risks specifically are addressed within the companies. We were studying organigrams and asking about reporting lines and reading about board oversight, etc. So just to map out and understand how these risks flow through the company. So increased clarity regarding these processes and policies and how it is implemented, and more transparency regarding this would be really very beneficial for everybody when talking about these risks. So, and when it comes to best practices, also relating to this challenge, we saw a very good example in one company where there was a clear and documented process for how they review and escalate risks related to sales opportunities in complex and high risk geographies. So this company in particular has a cross-functional risk committee at the executive team level that oversees these risks when it comes to high-risk geographies, high-risk products, and high-risk customers. So first, the risks are reviewed at the sales due diligence function, and they are focused on particularly on human rights risks, and then they decide to escalate these issues further. And then thereafter, the board is also informed of the most significant risks and how they are addressed. So that was an example of a very well documented process for oversight of this risk, particularly related to the sales sides.
Thanks very much, Therese. So let's same question to you, Tulia, but in relation to the renewable energy sector. So what are the salient risks that they face, and what are some examples of both leading practice and outstanding challenges?
So thank you, Sam, for your questions. Hello to everybody. My name is Tulia Machado Helland, and I'm head of human rights at Storebrand Asset Management, which is based in Norway. So in this project, we were leading the engagements with two companies. Regarding this, the renewable energy company, we were also leading together with the Church of England Pensions Board. So back to your question, the first one, the most salient CAHRA-related risk for renewable energy companies. So this industry is potentially exposed to several high-risk geographies where wind, solar, and hydroelectric projects are being developed. So here, by high-risk geographies, think Mexico, Colombia, or Western Sahara. And these high-risk geographies are characterized by weak to non-existent protections for local communities, militarization of the areas to protect business interests, and a lack of adequate stakeholder engagement. So the most common types of value chain proximity to human rights harms include relationships with private military and security companies, local police forces, and occupying power authorities. So what type of harms are we talking about? They are most often connected to these operations. So these harms occur usually due to the persecution of human rights defenders, a lack of free, prior, informed consent by impacted communities, indigenous peoples too, the presence of Uyghur forced labor in the renewable sector supply chain, and violations of international humanitarian law in occupied territory. So now I'll do it the other way around. I'll go for the leading practice first and then for the challenge. For the leading practice, there are many good practices in the report by this company, but I had to choose one. So I chose one that goes straight into what the UN guiding principles and Article 9, which everybody remembers right now, but that is ask companies to do, which is that they should enumerate in their policy commitments or elsewhere the most salient human rights and international humanitarian law risk and impacts linked to CAHRA, which they have identified through a salient human rights risk and impact assessment. And this is exactly what this company did. So this renewable energy company demonstrated the most systematic public disclosure of its human rights and conflict-related risk as identified through a human rights impact assessment that they conducted. And now I'm talking about what Rebecca was referring to earlier. So what they did, and I'm going into this chart in my head because I cannot show the slide, but they identified 15 salient human rights that the company had identified across its value chain. So by human rights, think child labor, labor rights, forced labor, access to remedy. But within those, there were also clearly referenced CAHRA risk and security practices. And these risks were assessed relative to their impact on right holders. And what are the right holders? Well, there were three categories there: the company's employees, the workers in its value chain, and the affected companies located in these high-risk rights areas. And in addition, these risks were also assessed based on their scope, scale, remediability, and likelihood across the value streams or companies' activities such as construction, development, services, operations, or the supply chain. So in particular for CAHRA, they had identified a higher risk at the construction and service operation stages. They also mapped the right holders at risk and specifically identify vulnerable groups such as children and young people, women and girls, indigenous people, and human rights defenders. The risk for CAHRA was assessed as not remediable. So for those of you that have had a look at the UN Development Program guidelines on heightened human diligence, I'm sure that this sounds familiar. And then finally, the risks were prioritized based on both their saliency for right holders and their materiality for the company, as well as the company's ability to address these risks. So now about the challenge for the company, I don't see it as a challenge that much, but because they're already working on this, but it's something that we're encouraging them to continue to develop. It's a clear system for where and when and how heightened human rights due diligence is conducted on an ongoing basis for new, and we discussed this a lot, but also existing projects, and in particular, if there are changes in the context of operations. And this should detail how the company systematically considers international humanitarian law risk in settings of conflict and occupation as part of its heightened human rights due diligence process. And this outside of the legal due diligence process that they show us during the call. So I leave it at that. I hope I didn't use all the time. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Tulia. I mean, I think just to build on a couple of points that were central to you and Therese's remarks is that, and this was indeed different with the renewable energy company that we engaged. However, more broadly, I think one of the primary challenges is a lot of companies are not treating a CAHRA-related risk systematically. They may be building in CAHRA-related elements to know your customer due diligence, to stakeholder engagement, to their policies. But whereas you see a lot of elaboration when it relates to anti-trafficking or forced labor or conflict minerals, we don't see that kind of same systematic thinking for the most part across companies, in spite of the fact that what the data indicates is that investors are increasingly treating these like systemic risk. There was a 2022 Thinking Ahead Global Institute survey in which 26 of the world's largest global asset managers identified geopolitical confrontation as a top 3 systemic risk. So I think what we hope to see and what we hope to draw out in this report and this project is the need for that systematic treatment of CAHRA-related risks. So I'd like to turn the mic over now to Camille from La Banque Postale Asset Management. And Camille, one of the reasons we felt your participation was really valuable in today, but also into the project, is that in the course of your career, you've been both a company representative responsible for human rights issues, as well as an investor engaging companies on CAHRA-related risk, especially a large group of French companies around their risk related to Russia, Ukraine. So wanted to ask you, what is special about the company shareholder relationship that lends itself as a pathway to drive better management of CAHRA risk? And can you provide any tips on what investors should bear in mind when they're seeking to solicit a positive response from their company counterparts during engagements? Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So maybe to start with, so basically what we've seen throughout our engagements is that a lot of companies do not apprehend CAHRA risk as a whole, and that's a bit what you've said before. Some might work specifically on regulatory or legal risks, some might focus on security risks or compliance issues, but they generally do not apprehend conflict as a global evolving issue, be it during crisis management or even for certain before developing a project in a conflict-affected area. However, the evolutions in one sphere, such as the human rights sphere, for instance, may be a clear indication of how the conflict might evolve in the long term, and therefore of the difficulties that the companies might soon be faced with, even when such evolutions have not yet had an immediate impact on their activities, operations, or even stakeholders. So having like this siloed or at least single focus approach has generally caused a lot of companies to not be able to understand conflict risks or evolutions and their implications for operations activities. And therefore, these companies were generally also not able to take strategic decisions accordingly and in a timely manner. What it means for us as an investor is that basically there might be a risk for the investment in the long term, because it's a signal that a company, basically by not being able to identify and understand the myriad of risks, obstacles, and trends to which it's faced with, might also miss certain like tipping points and put its business, employees, or generally stakeholders at risk. So investors, through the unique relationship that they have with investee companies, and more specifically with top management, and I'll come back to that afterwards, can bring this more broader approach to the table and can bring in practical examples of basically what are their expectations. On this, there is now more and more guidance on what it means to conduct a heightened human rights due diligence. However, we still have to recognize that the concept is still very new and vague for a lot of companies. Human rights due diligence generally is, so heightened human rights due diligence is even harder for a lot of them. They might understand it as a simple tick the box audit process, for certain companies as a deep dive into human rights issues in a conflict affected areas. So I think the role of investors in that case is really to bring a more practical view. They play a key role, I think, in setting out these expectations to companies, explain how they evaluate the company's response, how they would want a company to basically react in that type of conflict affected areas. And this might lead in a longer term to a better integration and operationalization, of the concept by companies. This, and you might not see it as an investor, and now I'm talking more of someone who worked in a company before, really helps in-house experts and operational teams, because basically it allows top management and decision makers to see that first, the issue of conflict affected areas is not just an issue that is an in-house problem or a civil society concern. It has repercussions on the business and also on other types of stakeholders, including shareholders. Second, that there are practical steps that can be taken to better understand conflict, to have a more appropriate response, and to take appropriate decisions and act responsibly. Bringing in its solutions and showing that it is feasible to undertake this type of due diligence is of the essence, and this really is the role of investors. And finally, investors can show that other companies in the same industry or even in other sectors, but which might be facing with the same types of issue, have come up with more practical approaches to deal with these issues. Once this is achieved, it gives a lot more leverage and resources to in-house experts. You have to remember that in a lot of cases, conducting a proper and broad heightened human rights due diligence might be a very costly and time-consuming process for companies. That generally there are plenty of other costly and very time-consuming studies and due diligence that are carried out at the same time, and that are already being done by the companies. So as such, having investors in the room engaging with companies on the importance of carrying out that broader conflict sensitivity analysis is basically essential, because it allows basically to get more resources, to get more budget, more time for in-house experts to do their work properly, to help inform the decision, to bring in capacity building exercises in-house, or even to bring human rights or conflict experts in the decision-making process or crisis management process when this might not have been the case beforehand. The tip I would have, but maybe we'll get to it also later on in the questions, is basically, as an investor, you have to be informed and aware of the issues that the company is going to be faced with in that conflict-affected area before, during, and after engagement. It is necessary to be properly informed in order to formulate reasonable expectations for companies. They have to deal with plenty, again, of risks, obstacles, impacts, divergent interests in that cases. And they will be more willing to hear your point if you also understand theirs and understand the operational obstacles that they might be facing with. So a fundamental, I think, pre-engagement stage, and this is really what Heartland and PeaceNexus brought to the table, is the consultation with external stakeholders and experts to understand the context, to understand what is actually going on on the ground, what are the interests and expectations from other stakeholders, the challenges, and basically what's at stake. And maybe I have other stuff, but I'll leave it there maybe, and we can keep on having the discussion if that's okay. I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, Camille. And would just encourage folks to put their questions in the chat, please, whether it's related to policy, practice, governance, whether it's related to specific CAHRA. I just would encourage you to put some questions to continue the conversation. So for a second round, and we're going to try and get through this relatively quickly so that we do have time for questions. And let's go back to Tulia. So from your perspective, what did you learn from the pilot project in terms of how more to effectively engage companies? How do you see this type of engagement, CAHRA specifically, evolving in the next few years? And really, what are the main missing ingredients for investors to undertake better company engagements on this subject? Thanks, Tulia.
Okay, that's a lot of questions again. Okay,
Yeah.
so thank you. So, okay, the first one was about how to more effectively engage companies and what we learned. I must say that I haven't been that familiar or haven't used that much at the Chatham House rules, and that was an element in this project. So I learned the value of having those. I think that it was a clear element that allowed for companies to open up and have honest and candid discussions, especially for some of them. And this is something that takes time to build that trust so you can share information, especially when you're feeling vulnerable as a company because you don't have all the solutions in hand. Well, we don't have all the solutions there either, but we are trying to come together to those solutions. So I think that that was a very good element that helped, especially some companies, to open up. Another element that I would think that it was extremely important to be effective in our dialogue was to create predictability, so companies feel comfortable with a clear structure for engagement. So, for example, from day one, we were already telling them, look, we're just going to have 3 meetings. This is what pretty much we're going to be covering, define areas, themes of engagement, policies, practices, and the governance structure. And we were also collaborating in making the agendas. I think that that's extremely important because we were looking for good examples and practices that they could use immediately or that they already have. So we were thinking, okay, what is okay and you feel comfortable telling us about your challenges to implement and to carry out a heightened human rights due diligence and how we can collaborate here. So I think that was extremely important, again, back to earning that trust. And then I would think that from our side, for the investor side, I would think that we did some capacity building also for investors. So I think a solid understanding of what heightened human rights due diligence is and the regulatory framework around it was essential because sometimes so to know that it's okay to ask companies, for example, to consider international humanitarian law and do an analysis accordingly. I've been asking these questions for many years now, and very often I get pushback, like companies saying, well, you know, international humanitarian law doesn't apply to us. So what are you talking about? So it's really good as an investor, because you are not an expert in international humanitarian law, to have the materials in your head and to have the knowledge to push back and say, well, in fact, this is this and this. So not that we got so much pushback in this project, but in general, I think that you get the confidence to talk about these issues in an easier way. So the second question was about how do I see the investor engagement on CAHRA evolving in the next few years? Well, I think that investors are getting more knowledge. Definitely, there is a lot of interest, and we see it here in this call today. There are more guidelines out there for companies. I mean, companies have lots of guidelines now to check, and there are more and more emerging guidelines, like the one from Heartland, which investors can check. Now we're also launching this report today, so we always will have even more guidelines. At the same time, unfortunately, there is more and more conflict in the world. So I see increased engagement, or at least pursuing engagement from the investor side as part of our own human rights due diligence. At the same time, considering how things are moving in the US and the EU with regulation, I would say that I expect a pushback from some American companies, maybe in particular due to the US ESG backlash there, maybe even from some European companies, which I've been hearing that sometimes now, in the name of innovation, competitiveness, and reducing reporting burden. a reference to the Omnibus, EU Omnibus, I guess most of you have heard about. But I think that at the end of the day, however, it's important to keep in mind that respecting international humanitarian law has created stability in the world. And this is also extremely important for businesses to flourish. So I think that that's the answer there. So let's not lose that compass. And as far as high-risk industries, when it comes to CAHRA, and we haven't discussed it here, but I would like to say that aerospace and defense, there's more and more investments there going that way, as well as defense tech. I think there are industry investors need to pay more attention, because I've been talking to some of those and they're not doing their due diligence. Human rights forget hiding human rights due diligence. So last, it was what is needed to empower investors to undertake even better company engagement. So I would say that definitely we need more knowledge. These are complex issues. We need clear practical guidelines, and there's a lot of practical information to take on by investors in the report. And definitely we need an understanding that CAHRAs need to be included in our own human rights due diligence. I think that, I mean, it's okay to wish, right, that it would be very nice to have specific regulation on human rights. We'll see what's going to happen in the end, at the EU level at least. And I would love to have, in particular, clear regulation on CAHRAs too, and not only voluntary guidelines for companies and investors. So we conduct our heightened human rights due diligence. So that would be really nice. But in the absence of clear regulation, I think that I would like to highlight that the government recommendations are also a possibility. And this is something that we have in Norway, for example. The Norwegian government has issued recommendations to businesses to avoid contributing to the occupation of Palestine, for example, or Western Sahara. And this also empowers us as investors to have those conversations, because we can show those recommendations. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tulia. I'm going to quickly go to Therese, same set of questions. So primary lesson learned, state of investor evolution on CAHRA, and what do you need as an investor to have more effective engagements?
Thank you, Sam. So at Scandia, the first thing we look at when we choose engagement or this type of very specific engagement on a specific topic is a knowledge, what we call knowledge partner, that we have a good knowledge partner on board, so we can get the buy-in and create a meaningful and constructive dialogue. And also it enables you to deep dive quickly into the core issues. And this engagement in particular, where the aim was to establish best practices, it was a very collaborative process. So we really needed the companies to commit and engage with us. So being able to offer them a learning opportunity and also was a way to get their buy-in and to share their experience, etc. So that was very valuable to have access to the project partners' network, or their knowledge first of all, but also to their network of researchers and consultants, which we used and had very interesting dialogue. So having this collaborative approach was very beneficial, I think, in this pilot project. And going forward, I agree with what Tulia said, seeing to what the world context is like, and the defense industry will be very interesting to engage with. And also it would be great to do it with knowledge partners that allows you to define expectations and understand that context, which is very particular and special as well, where the companies really have the advantage when it comes to insight and information. But yeah, that's very important sector.
Thanks very much, Therese. I'm going to hand the mic now over to Kristen. I asked y'all for questions and you responded. So Kristen, please take it from here.
Thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, I'm very pleased to facilitate this Q&A. And I think it's going to be a kind of a struggle because there was no questions and now there is probably dozens of questions at the same time. So I'll try to pick the one that maybe, we know we can provide an answer right now. So yeah, just maybe 2 words about me. I'm Kristen. I'm the business engagement lead at PeaceNexus, and we've been actively supporting this project. So I'm probably going to start with the question from Isabel, and I'll direct this question to Cami. Cami, what do you think about the role of investor engagement with portfolio companies in mitigating harm and promoting peace-positive practices? And I think there is also a second part of these questions is how an investor use their leverage to influence companies operating in high-risk zones without overstepping mandates or worsening conditions.
Thanks, Kristen. On the first part on promoting peace-positive practices, to be perfectly honest, we're unfortunately not there yet. We're already trying to make companies understand the potential harm that they might be causing or at least linked to in relation to conflict-affected areas, and we want to help them go through a more robust peace-positive building process. However, at the moment, we are not there already. I think this is part of the discussion you might have when you try to focus on responsible exit practices. Instead of exiting, basically trying to make companies basically stay, but both prevent their harm and help peace building practices. But it's still, I would say, the beginning of the discussion. On the second part of your question, which was how can investors use their leverage without basically overstepping mandates or worsening conditions, I think it's also closely linked to a question that was asked by Andrew Belloc. I think there are 2 things. The first one was basically the practice of conducting your own your own human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence as an investor. If you do not want to cause more harm or basically push the companies towards solutions that might be harmful to people at the end of the day, you have to be informed. You have to understand the trends, the evolution of the conflict. You have to understand the interest of stakeholders, and therefore consulting with appropriate stakeholders beforehand, including NGOs and civil society, is basically of the essence to do that properly. The second thing I think is you have to focus on the objectives and expectations of the heightened human rights due diligence. What you're looking for is not an audit, is not a questionnaire, is not a proper one-step process that a company would conduct. It's basically certain objectives and expectations. It's a level of maturity and of understanding of the conflict by the company. It's a level of understanding of the risks and a level of understanding of how these risks might impact and might be a gap regarding the engagements and commitments that the company already has. So basically what you should focus on as an investor is basically try to evaluate the importance given to human rights in decision-making, the efforts that are made by the company, their level of understanding. And if you take it that way, you will probably have more leverage over how the company might respond at the end of the day. And finally, and this is more linked to actually Andrew's question on basically, is it more effective when shareholders versus potential shareholders or groups like Amnesty International engage? This was actually the 3rd tip I had regarding effective engagement with companies. Conflict is a very sensitive issue for most of them. So you have to take into account, first off, the levers that work on the company. Is it reputational risk? Is it legal risk? Is it operational issues? Is it a cultural thing into the company? You also have to take into account that cultural aspect. Certain companies, and this is something we've really seen throughout our engagements with companies operating in Russia, Ukraine, a lot of French companies would rather speak to a French investor on the issue and in a one-room thing with Chatham House rules and in a very specific way of doing it, because they do not want it to be a public issue. They want to be able to discuss practical matters with people who might understand them maybe a bit better. So there's a cultural aspect, and you have to prepare that beforehand and basically have an engagement strategy that maybe allows you to have a better leverage over the company, I think, at the end of the day. So it really depends on who you're engaging with, I would say. I don't know.
No, thanks, Cami. Yeah, no, thanks, Tammy. Actually, you have addressed like a few questions at the same time, so it's perfect. I'll take a question from Matthew, because that's the kind of questions that we get many times from different investors. Is like, what public tools would you recommend to map global CAHRAs and public companies' value chains in order to calculate the overall CAHRA risk score per investment portfolio? And it's really a question that we get a lot. It's kind of like, I'm an investor, I have a portfolio of maybe 6,000 companies. How I can start, where I start. And maybe I'll just direct this question to Sam, because you have been quite active in this field, and I think the methodology that you have developed has been quite useful.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So, I mean, look, essentially the simple answer is expanding the scope of your resources as an investor. And it also highlights, unfortunately, a deficiency within the current ESG ecosystem as it relates to social risk, is that historically and methodologically, the emphasis has been on how a context impacts the company, which is, of course, a critical piece, but the missing piece is, how does the company impact the rights holder? So a lot of the work that we do at Heartland is really serving as the connective tissue between civil society and investors, whether that's from the grassroots to the international level, whether that's NGOs, academia, legal organizations, et cetera, because you really simply cannot do rigorous, heightened human rights due diligence without incorporating the research and analysis of rights holders or by the organizations that work on their behalf. Of course, you also have to consider their position within the ecosystem and do multiple source verification, but it's really about expanding the source. And so when we do portfolio analyses, we're just simply employing, not simply, but we're employing a broader range of resources apart from headline news, which also has the added benefit of taking us away from an exclusive controversy-based scoring approach or analytical approach, and really looking at a company's full CAHRA risk universe as we did during the course of the project.
So there is not like a solution, that off-the-shelf solution, like any climate discussion that we have right now, and like you can just like look at MSCI or any other data providers to get a bit like guidance and start your own engagement. So it's still quite ad hoc, right? Relying a lot on expertise from you guys or and others.
We really had to create our own system, and others are out there that have different approaches. But for us, it was really answering this need of growing regulatory demand, growing contextual demand, the increase in geopolitical conflict and fragility, and the absence of, a proactive, systematic approach to CAHRA-related risks.
All right, thank you. We'll take two other questions, and I think that'll be it. There was a question from Vicky, if there is any examples of company that engage in country in a collective manner to identify risk and engage with right holders and stakeholders, including on identifying mitigation measures. I mean, I think I can also answer that one. I don't think from the engagement with the companies, we didn't see anyone that actually were doing joint work with other companies. We have seen maybe some of them using, an umbrella of NGOs or other partners on the ground to maybe facilitate the engagement with communities, but not necessarily as an umbrella of companies doing so. But I don't know if anyone wants to add on this.
Maybe just one minor point to add to that one, Kristen. We did have a few of the companies point to multi-stakeholder initiatives they participate in as a space where some of these discussions might happen. In particular, the Global Network Initiative was mentioned as a place where some of these conversations are happening. So maybe just to throw that in there as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe as the last question, because we have only 2-3 minutes, the question from Kate. Can anyone speak a little more about the overcoming the unique challenges for mitigating the risk identified in this environment, and especially when it's more challenging to reach the most vulnerable right holders? maybe I'll take a first stab to that one, and anyone can actually complete. But I think mitigating risk in CAHRA is hard, and because the people most affected are often the hardest to reach. You know, they are displaced, they are silenced, they are at risk if they speak out. So I think to overcome this, and some of from the engagement, we've seen that some of them are using local intermediaries, NGOs with trusted access to these communities. They use different ways to triangulate, information from different sources, civil society, media, etc. And I think one that is also quite important is to co-design feedback and grievance channels with community representatives. I think the importance is to ensure they are safe and trusted and anonymous, and that they are culturally appropriate. It's what mentioned Camille also at the same time. I think this came out during the discussion, especially in relation to energy projects, but you need to create a very safe space and easy communication channel between the project holders and the communities. And I think at the same time, you need to invest in the long-term presence and relationship. It's not just fly in and fly out audits, you need boots on the ground. And you need to build the internal capacity of your staff on the ground to really understand the conflict dynamics and adopt sort of like a conflict sensitivity approach. But I don't know if anyone wants to add, because I think we're almost running out of time. All right. Thank you very much then.
Thank you, Kristen, and thanks for the numerous questions. I know we weren't able to get to them all, but please do feel free to reach out to us. You may have seen the report while we were doing the webinar has gone live on our website. I encourage you to please take a look. Do circle back with your feedback and thoughts. I think all of the project partners and involved investors would greatly appreciate that. It looks like there were some resources that were also shared in the chat function. We'll try to capture those and pass those on as useful. Do expect a thank you email after this webinar. Well, as I said, we'll have the recording, we'll have these slides and the report as well. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to engage with you on this issue. Obviously, it's the one where there's still a lot of work that needs to be done despite some of the leading practices we've talked about today. So I look forward to that collective engagement with all of you, and have a wonderful morning or afternoon. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all of our speakers today as well. Take care.